Recently, Apple has passed the $1 trillion valuation mark. I ask myself the question, what was the biggest company of all time? In this video, we'll quickly touch on the 8 most valuable companies in history and then spend some time on number 1 because it's a fascinating story. This company was so large that they literally geographically shaped the world we know today. Alright, let's get into it. At number 8, we have Microsoft in 1999. The company was valued at $0.9 trillion at the height of the dot-com bubble. Number 7 is Apple in 2018. This is due to the persistent popularity of the iPhone, which makes up about 70% of the company's profits. Though some do speculate that this trillion-dollar stock figure is more complicated due to low interest rates making it viable for the companies to buy back its own stock, pushing up the stock price further. At number 6, we have Standard Oil. In 1900, this company was worth $1 trillion. Standard Oil was soon broken up by the American government into, well, pretty much every major American oil company. At number 5, we have PetroChina. In 2007, they were valued at $1.4 trillion, and this was right at the peak of oil prices just before the GFC. The 4th most valuable company of all time is Saudi Aramco, valued at $4.1 trillion at its peak in 2010. From here on, we have to step back in time, hundreds of years to reach the real heavyweights. At number 3 and 2 respectively are the South Sea Company worth $4.3 trillion and the Mississippi Company worth $6.5 trillion, both in 1720. Of course, these numbers are adjusted for inflation. The reason for these astronomical valuations is quite interesting. In 1720, a bubble formed around speculation of trade between North and South America. The two companies mentioned promised that they could capitalize on trade between the American continents, and their stock rose accordingly. The speculators in these companies would coin the term millionaire. In reality, mass trade between the Americas didn't really end up happening, and the bubble soon popped. Okay, so on to number 1. Valued at a ridiculous $7.9 trillion in 1637 is the Dutch East India Company. The story of the Dutch East India Company is absolutely fascinating. The story starts in the Netherlands in a time called the Golden Century, a period of Dutch history between 1600 and 1700 where Amsterdam was one of the richest cities in the world due to its strong international trade. Trade was essentially how all countries made their money. In 1600, the Dutch government was worried about England becoming dominant in trade. To combat this threat, they sponsored the creation of the Dutch East India Company in 1602 and allowed the firm to become a monopoly in Asian trade. The company quickly became one of the dominant players in the trade of spices between Europe and Indonesia. Spices might not seem like much today, but back then, spices were scarce and extremely valuable. They were used in medicine, to preserve cooked food, and to add flavor to meat. Spices actually improved the quality of life. Dutch East India Company is one of the most important companies in history, and one of the reasons for this is that it was the very first company to go public on the world's first stock exchange. From here, it continued to grow until it had 70,000 employees at its peak. In the 1600s, that was more than 0.01% of the world's population working for this one company. The firm ran their own shipyards, built a network of hundreds of bases, and had anything from offices to warehouse and heavy workstations. In order to keep their ports and continue trade, Dutch East India Company developed their own army to protect the land that they gained. And this is where things start getting beyond any company that we can imagine today. As the company grew, the foreign colonies gained more land and possessed a sense of governmental powers. The Dutch East India Company had the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, mint its own coins, and even established new colonies. The company was even used to fight against the Spanish Empire in the early 1600s, and remember, this was a publicly traded company doing all of this. It doesn't stop there though, there were also expansive sailing expeditions that resulted in the discovery of new land. As it turns out, the Dutch East India Company actually helps shape the geographical knowledge of the modern world. They would stay operational for 2 centuries and had effectively transformed itself from a corporate entity into a state and then an empire. Okay, so now we know that the company started by trading spice and ended up a tyrannical empire. But what was its most profitable business? The answer isn't one you would expect. The peak of their wealth came from flowers. Tulips, to be exact. And the story of how this happened has gone down in infamy. It tells us a deep archetype story. Although technologies in the world may advance, human nature remains the same. Tulips were first introduced to Europe from Turkey and reached Amsterdam in 1554. The plants are immediately perceived as exotic goods, and their popularity began to rise. Having tulips in your garden became an important status symbol. In addition to this, the thing about tulips is they take 7 to 12 months to flower and only bloom for about a week. This rareness and the fact that they are a status symbol and highly valued made the tulip product a prime candidate for the first financial bubble in history. The tulip bubble. You see, at the time, the Dutch were pioneers of modern finance. They devised a way to set up a market where you could trade tulips all year round, even if they weren't in bloom. The prices were set by traders that signed to a contract based on future prices. This was the very first futures derivative market, the same kind that we use to trade stocks with today. Over time, the tulip market became more complicated and flowers were priced according to their rarity. As with all derivative markets, things tend to go out of control sometimes. The prices of the tulips are pushed higher and higher by speculators who plan to turn around and sell them for a profit. This is the very same thing that happens in all modern financial bubbles, from people flipping houses expecting the next guy to pay for it, to stock and bond traders doing the same thing. As I said, human nature stays the same. Many merchants sold all of their belongings to purchase a few tulip bulbs for the purpose of selling them at a higher profit than they could ever imagine in their lifetimes. This was the 1630s, and the average person could expect to live fewer than 40 years and be lucky to make any money at all. Meanwhile, some of the tulip traders were earning the equivalent of $62,000 a month. But it seemed like the tulips were a quick way to paradise and everyone wanted in. During the build-up and height of tulip mania, the Dutch East India Company incorporated the tulip trade into their operations and the stock price began to rocket upwards. By this stage, even England and France are trading tulips on the London Stock Exchange. The acceleration of price continued and soon does a price explosion of 20-fold just in a single month. To give you an idea, at the peak, a single tulip bulb was worth 10 times more than a craftsman's annual wage. By this point, the Dutch East India's value had risen to that infamous massive $7.9 trillion mark. To highlight how huge this was just one more time, if you put Apple, Microsoft and Google together, Dutch East India Company was worth 3 times that combined value. So you might be wondering, what happened next? Like all bubbles, the tulip bubble popped in late 1636. So what caused the crash? It turns out that some of the buyers in North Holland refused to show up to routine tulip bulb auctions. It signaled to the market that people just weren't going to pay any higher for the plant. This event caused the tulip price to fall a little. Investors then got cold feet and decided to sell. So the price fell more. More people saw the price falling and decided to sell as well, and the cycle continued. Soon, the market violently imploded. Within just a few weeks, tulip bulbs were only worth 1/100th of their former price. This resulted in a full-blown panic throughout Holland and an economic crash that lasted years. The Dutch government would later make changes to the financial system to make sure that this never happened again. So what about the Dutch East India Company? What happened to them? Well, the company stayed very powerful until the mid-1700s, but after bad management and a war between the English and the Dutch, the company was dissolved and overtaken by the government in 1799, and the colonies of the company became Dutch colonies.